So we're talking about the gap between rich and poor, and you're welcome to call in 0345 6060 973. Should we change the tax system in some way, the way it works? Let's talk now to Gary Stevenson, who joins us. He's an economist and former city trader who was one of the signatories of a group of rich people calling for more tax. So good morning to you, Gary. Is the gap between rich and poor getting wider?
It definitely looks like it's expanding this year, especially if we look at the Times Rich List out today. So according to that Times Rich List, there's been a £600 billion increase in the wealth of the top 250 people in this country. About a 22% increase. That's pretty much very similar to the entire amount of money that the government has spent dealing with the coronavirus crisis. So it's a huge amount of money. It's something about £12,000, £13,000 per adult in this country. That's the increase in wealth of the super rich.
And this increase in wealth, these extra billionaires, is this because of the pandemic? I mean, has that heightened the problem?
It's crazy to think about it, but it is. In fact, I wrote an article around March last year saying that one of the big consequences we're going to see from this crisis is a massive increase of the wealth in the super rich. And that is the result of the way that the government has dealt with this crisis. Now, there were times in the past when the government used to deal with crises by taxing the richest people in our society. But what has happened here in this crisis has been very different. What the government has done, combined with the central bank, the Bank of England, has simply printed a huge amount of money. They printed about £450 billion. And that money has largely ended up with richer and higher income people. Now, richer and higher income people, they tend to use their money to buy assets like houses and stocks and shares. That pushes their prices up. And who owns the most houses and the most stocks and shares? Well, it's super rich. So because the government has printed their way out of this crisis, or at least tried to, that has led to a massive increase in the wealth of people who have the most wealth, which is, of course, the super wealthy.
And is this something that has just happened, or has this been going on? I mean, did the economic crash have any effect on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was a trader in 2008, after the 2008 crisis, and I made my money by basically betting that pretty much exactly the same thing would happen after the 2008 crisis, because really, this is deja vu all over again for the government and the central bank, because back in 2008, they also attempted to deal with the crisis by simply printing their way out of it. The end result was a massive increase in stock prices and house prices. So they've done it back then, over 10 years ago now. They tried to print their way out and ended up with the richest, and they're doing it again. So I'm predicting we're going to see a very similar kind of recovery after this crisis, which is fantastic increases in wealth for the richest and not very much for the rest of us.
Well, yes, what about the impact? I mean, I'm describing this as a problem, but is it a problem if you have a lot of super rich, as long as that wealth kind of spreads out to others as well?
You know what, that is a really important question, actually, and that is something which I think a lot about and something which I talk a lot about, because I think it's really important for ordinary people, like people listening to this show, to understand that when the super rich get rich, that's not just an abstract number. You know, that's houses, that's buildings, that's land, that's natural resources. And it's the natural resources and the buildings and the houses that the rest of us need. Now, if they have a huge amount of money, then that means we need to pay them to use it. So it creates a cash flow from ordinary people to the richest, which they then use to push up house prices. And the end result, which is what we've seen over the last 20 years, is a massive decrease in affordability of housing for ordinary people, from ordinary families. And I talk about this a lot, and I've explained very clearly, actually, how this works on my YouTube, Gary's Economics, on a video called What is Wealth? So if people want to understand exactly how the increase in wealth from the richest is damaging ordinary people by making houses less affordable, I think let's check that video.
Well, I will certainly have a look at that. I'm sure people will do that. I mean, so you're saying there's a direct link between more billionaires and the problem with housing?
Clive, I'm not just saying it. I've been betting on it for 12 years and I've made millions of pounds doing it.
Right.
If we allow all of the money to go to the super rich, the fact is, super rich people, if you give them more money, they don't spend it. They use that money to buy assets like houses, like the rest of us need. So really, it makes sense. If you give money to ordinary people, they're going to spend it. That's going to go back into the economy. That's going to drive wages up. If you give it to the super rich, they're going to buy assets, and it's going to make housing less affordable. So ultimately, if the money goes to the richest instead of the rest of us, what that means is house prices up, wages down, and that means, unfortunately, a bleak future for ordinary people. So I really think we need to do something about this.
And what do you think we should do about this? There's a lot of talk about a wealth tax, but that can mean a lot of things. What's your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's look at the figures here, Clive, right? The government has increased its debt by £450 billion during this crisis, and 250 individuals have increased their wealth by £600 billion. And at the same time, how are we thinking of dealing with this crisis? Well, we're looking at taxing ordinary people like you and me, Clive. Well, I think the 250 richest people in this country, they shouldn't be profiting from a crisis when ordinary people have to pay for it. We really have to look at ways to get these super rich to pay. But, of course, I understand we need to be very careful when we do this, Clive. These people, they've got the best tax accountants in the world working for them, and they will try and dodge any taxes that we bring in. But we need to bring in taxes. But when we do it, we need to make sure that they're targeted well enough so that the super rich have to pay them and they don't end up getting screwed just by ordinary people like yourself, Clive.
But we're talking about often multinational companies, aren't we, and international billionaires who, if we come up with something, they'll just move somewhere else. So it's really, isn't it a global problem?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Clive, because just right now, as we speak, there's a internationally coordinated attempt driven by Biden, President of the US, to bring in a minimum tax rate on corporations so that corporations cannot compete countries against one another. And Germany, Italy, France, Japan, they've all signed up for this, along with the USA. And it's being blocked by Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak's father-in-law owns a multinational billion-pound corporation. Rishi Sunak is blocking this from happening. So countries want to get together to make the super rich pay tax. At the moment, Rishi Sunak and the UK government are stopping that from happening. So, yes, we need international coordination, international cooperation to make the rich pay their taxes. But at the moment, the UK government is stopping that from happening rather than supporting it. And I think we need to turn around to Rishi Sunak, whose father-in-law is a billionaire, and ask him, why are you stopping corporations from paying their fair share of tax?
And have we ever had a tax system where the extremely rich pay a large amount of money?
If you go and look back at the post-war period, 50s, 60s, there were much, much higher rates of tax on the very richest in the country. And I think it's not a coincidence that back then housing was much, much more affordable. You know, in that period, ordinary people, you know, people working completely ordinary jobs without degrees or anything, could afford housing, especially if they're willing to save up for a few years. So if you go and look back at the 50s, 60s, when taxation of the richest was much more affordable, you know, famously, the Beatles spoke about paying 95% tax. But if you go and look at that period where we did tax the rich more effectively, housing was more affordable and quality of life in many ways was more affordable for ordinary people. And, you know, that's 50 years ago before the invention of the internet, Clive. If we were to bring in a better tax system now that hit the richest instead of ordinary working people, we could have so much more quality of life, more affordable housing, just a phenomenally better economy than what we have at the moment.
But it isn't part of the housing issue that we just haven't got enough houses. I mean, if we built more houses, then surely they would be more affordable.
Well, you know, when I was a trader, Clive, I worked in London for a few years, now transferred to Tokyo. Tokyo's got 38 million people there. They've got a lot of houses, and housing's not that much more affordable. I think, really, this is a global problem. The problem of housing is a global problem. You can see unaffordable housing any major country you go to in the world. All the major cities it's happening. So it's not really a London-specific problem. It's an international problem. And that's because international wealth, international capital, can cross borders freely. These super rich, they can buy houses all over the world. And if we build more, they'll buy them. So really, if you compare internationally, the places where housing is affordable and the housing is not affordable, it's largely down to how unequal the place is. If you go look at Moscow or Mumbai or Hong Kong, housing is even more unaffordable than what it is here. If we don't do anything about inequality, I think we will move to a future like that, where housing will be even less affordable. And that's going to mean ordinary children from ordinary families won't have houses to raise the kids in.
Gary, thank you very much. That's Gary Stevenson, economist, former city trader. And he signed a document calling for some kind of wealth tax. What do you think? Do we need to narrow the gap between rich and poor? Do we just accept it's there? And what do we tax? Who do we tax to get some of this money back that's been spent? Maybe you think we don't need to.